The Praetorian Guard, Chapter 9, An Unexpected Reunion. The streets of Nova Lux, the gleaming capital of the Dominion, were alive with the familiar rhythms of a city that never rested. Towering buildings cast long shadows across the grand avenues, where civilians, merchants and military personnel moved like a vast interconnected machine. The air buzzed with the sounds of the bustling marketplace, vendors shouting their wares, children laughing as they chased one another, and the steady hum of vehicles flying above. But beneath this surface, unseen currents of power and secrecy flowed, where decisions that could topple empires were made in hushed whispers. John moved through the city, his face hidden beneath the hood of his civilian jacket, blending into the crowd as if he were one of them. It felt strange to be back in Nova Lux after his first real mission with the shadows of the night. The transition from the cold, calculated darkness of the shadows to the vibrant, noisy world of the capital left him feeling disoriented. His heart still carried the weight of Duke Darius Cool's assassination. The image of the Duke slumping over his desk burned into John's memory. It had been John's first mission where he had watched a man die by his hand, or at least as part of his hand, and that realization lingered like a heavy cloak over his shoulders. The mission was successful. Sarah had told him to keep focused on that simple truth. But standing here, among the innocents of the city, John found it hard to shake the sense that something had shifted inside him. He couldn't share that truth with anyone, not even himself, not fully. It was a truth that belonged only to the shadow. The smell of roasting meat and spiced drinks wafted from nearby stalls, and John's stomach growled softly in response. He hadn't eaten since early that morning, his mind too occupied to notice the hunger gnawing at him. The people around him moved with purpose, but John was aimless, wandering through the maze of streets that stretched out before him. It was strange, really, how quickly one could go from being part of something so secretive and dangerous to being swallowed by the mundanity of daily life. No one here knew what he had done. No one knew that he had just been part of an operation to remove a powerful duke from the chessboard of the Dominion's power struggle. John was trying to lose himself in the crowd, to leave behind the identity he had assumed in the shadows. But that same sense of hyper-awareness that had kept him alive during the mission kept him alert now. His senses were sharp, too sharp. He noticed every conversation, every minor movement in the sea of people around him. And then, a voice pierced through the noise, sharp, familiar, cutting straight through the fog of his thoughts. "John?" He froze. His heart seemed to skip a beat, and for a moment he thought he had imagined it. But when he turned, his eyes locking onto the source of the voice, there was no doubt left. Lieutenant Karavos stood just a few feet away, her face a mixture of shock and joy. The same Karavos he had trained with at the academy, his closest friend during those formative years. Her dark hair was tied back in a sleek ponytail, and she wore the crisp, dark uniform of the Dominion Navy, the insignia of a lieutenant gleaming on her chest. John's throat tightened as the memories hit him with full force. Kara had been there through everything, through the grueling physical training, the sleepless nights spent cramming for exams, the hours spent in sparring matches that had left them both bruised and exhausted. She had been his rock during those years, the one person who had truly understood him. And now, seeing her here, in the middle of the bustling capital, was like a ghost from his past rising up to confront him. Kara excused herself from the group of officers she had been talking to, and walked toward him, her steps quick and deliberate. John felt an urge to slip away, to disappear into the crowd before she reached him, but it was too late. The look on her face told him she wasn't going to let him vanish again. "John, is that really you?" Kara's voice was filled with a mixture of disbelief and excitement as she closed the distance between them. Her eyes flicked over him, taking in the changes, the years of distance that had grown between them since their last meeting. John swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Kara, I didn't expect to see you here." She stopped just a few steps away, her expression softening as the initial shock wore off. "I didn't expect to see you either. I thought you were still out there, somewhere on the frontier, serving with the Praetorian Guard. What happened to you?
You just vanished.
John could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected to run into anyone from his past, let alone Kara. His mind scrambled for an explanation, something plausible that wouldn't give away the truth of what he had become.
I, got reassigned.
John said carefully, his voice steady, though his pulse raced beneath the surface.
Things changed after the academy. I'm working a different role now.
Kara's brow furrowed, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him.
Reassigned? Where?
John knew he had to give her something. Some reason for his sudden disappearance, some lie to cover the truth. He couldn't tell her that he was now part of the Dominion's most secretive and lethal unit, carrying out covert missions that involved assassination and sabotage. The Shadows demanded secrecy above all else, and reconnecting with his old life was a risk he couldn't afford to take.
I got pulled into the diplomatic corps.
John lied, keeping his voice even.
Security detail for high-profile diplomats mostly. It's different from the Guard, but it's where I'm needed.
Kara blinked, clearly taken aback.
The diplomatic corps? You're doing bodyguard work now?
Her voice was laced with surprise, and for a moment, John feared she wouldn't believe him. He forced a casual shrug, trying to appear nonchalant.
Yeah, it wasn't what I expected either, but it's important work. Protecting diplomats during high-stakes negotiations, escorting them through hostile territories, there's a lot happening behind the scenes that most people don't know about.
Kara nodded slowly, though a hint of suspicion lingered in her eyes.
I guess that makes sense. Things have been tense lately, especially with the outer sectors getting more volatile. But I've got to admit, John, I never pictured you as the diplomatic type. You were always more of a frontline kind of guy.
John laughed softly, though his chest tightened.
Yeah, I thought that too. But, you know, the Dominion shifts people where they're needed. And right now, that's where I am.
Kara seemed to accept the explanation, though her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, as if she were trying to read between the lines of what he wasn't saying.
Well, I'm glad to see you're still in one piece,
she said with a grin, her skepticism fading into something warmer.
It's been too long, John. You dropped off the map, and I didn't know if I'd ever run into you again.
John's stomach twisted with guilt. He hadn't just dropped off the map, he had been pulled into the shadows, into a world that Kara could never know about. The life he led now was one of secrets, one where old friends couldn't be trusted with the truth.
It's good to see you too, Kara,
John said, meaning it more than he expected.
I've missed this. Seeing familiar faces.
Kara's smile widened, and for a moment the years seemed to melt away, and John could almost believe they were back at the academy, teasing each other over failed drills and sleepless nights.
You were always terrible at staying in touch,
Kara teased, her tone light.
But I guess now you've got an excuse, being all secretive and important.
John chuckled, though the weight of the lie pressed down on him.
Yeah, something like that.
They stood in a brief silence, the noise of the street washing over them, but Joan's thoughts were elsewhere, struggling with the reality of what he had become and the mask he was now wearing for one of the few people he had ever truly trusted. Kara leaned against the wall of a nearby building, crossing her arms as she looked at him with an appraising eye.
So, what's it like? Being on bodyguard duty, I imagine it's pretty different from what we thought we'd be doing when we were still at the academy.
John nodded, choosing his words carefully.
It's different, yeah. A lot more political. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that goes into keeping the Empire stable. Negotiations, deals, meetings with factions from the outer sectors. My job's mostly to make sure the people making those decisions stay alive long enough to make them.
Kara raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued.
Sounds like you've got a front-row seat to all the big decisions. Must be interesting. It has its moments,
John said, managing a smile.
But it's not all action. A lot of waiting around, keeping an eye on things, staying alert. Still, it's important work.
Kara nodded, her eyes softening.
I'm glad you're doing all right, John. Really. I've missed having you around. You always kept me grounded when things got tough.
John felt a pang of guilt at her words. The person Kara was talking about, the John she had known at the academy, felt like a distant memory now. He had been a soldier then, with clear goals and an honorable mission. But the shadows had changed him. His missions now were steeped in secrecy and moral ambiguity, where the lines between right and wrong blurred into darkness.
What about you?
John asked, eager to shift the conversation away from himself.
How's life been treating you?
Kara's face brightened and she leaned back, relaxing as she launched into her story.
I got stationed on the frontier for a while, patrolling the outer sectors and keeping the trade routes clear from pirates. You wouldn't believe how wild things get out there. Entire regions with barely any law, and we're expected to keep the peace. It was tough, but it was good work. After a time, I got promoted to lieutenant, and now I'm back here at HQ, handling fleet operations from the capital.
John smiled, glad to hear that Kara had thrived after the academy. She had always been one of the best, sharp, determined, and fiercely loyal. It didn't surprise him that she had risen quickly through the ranks.
Your father must be proud,
John said, remembering how Kara's father had been a legendary figure in the Dominion Navy. Kara laughed.
Oh, he's still out there commanding ships, thinking he's the greatest captain Galaxy's ever seen. But yeah, he's proud. It's been nice being back in the capital for a while. Feels like I'm more in the loop now, with everything that's happening politically.
Joan's heart clenched at her words. He wasn't just out of the loop. He was in a completely different world now, a world Kara could never be part of. As Kara glanced at her watch, a small frown tugged at the corners of her mouth.
I've got to get going,
she said, her tone regretful.
Briefing in about 15 minutes. But we should catch up again. Maybe grab a drink. Talk about old times.
John hesitated. The idea of spending more time with Kara was tempting. She was a connection to the life he used to have, a reminder of who he used to be. But reconnecting with her meant dragging her closer to his world, and that was something he couldn't allow.
I'll see what I can do,
John said carefully, keeping his tone light.
I'm not sure how long I'll be in the capital, but if I get some free time, I'll reach out.
Kara's eyes searched his face, sensing the distance he was trying to put between them.
Don't disappear on me again, okay? I don't know what you're caught up in, but you can still make time for friends.
John forced a smile.
I'll try.
With a final nod, Kara turned and walked back toward the group of officers she had been with earlier, throwing one last glance over her shoulder before disappearing into the crowd. As John stood there, watching her go, the weight of the lies he had just told pressed down on him like an iron shroud. He had kept Kara safe by lying to her, by keeping her in the dark about his real role in the Dominion. But in doing so, he had pushed away one of the few connections he had left to his old life. Turning away from the street, John made his way back toward the heart of the city, his thoughts heavy. He had chosen the shadows, and with that choice came the realization that he couldn't hold on to his past. Kara represented the life he had left behind, the life he could never return to. The shadows had claimed him now, and there was no room for anything else. A week had passed since Joan's unexpected reunion with Kara in the streets of Nova Lux. The encounter had stirred something deep within him, an ache for the past, for the simplicity of life before the shadows had claimed him. Despite his instincts telling him to keep his distance, John couldn't shake the idea of seeing her again. Kara had been a friend, a confidant, and a reminder of the person he had once been. And for just one night, he wanted to feel that connection again, to live outside the dark world he now inhabited. So when Kara's message had come through, light-hearted and playful, asking him to meet her for a drink, John had hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. It wasn't a smart move. He knew the risks of getting too close to anyone, especially someone like Kara, who had known him before. But he was tired of hiding, tired of the secrecy, and Kara's smile still lingered in his mind. Now, as John walked through the city streets toward the place they'd agreed to meet, he couldn't help but feel a knot of anticipation tightening in his chest. He had chosen a more casual outfit tonight, just simple civilian clothes, and made an effort to look like the old John she had once known. No tactical gear, no hidden weapons, just a man trying to reclaim a bit of his old life. The cafe they had picked was tucked away in one of Nova Lux's quieter districts. It wasn't far from the more crowded, bustling parts of the city, but it had a charm that made it feel almost secluded, an escape from the vast sprawl of the capital. The warm glow of lanterns lined the outdoor seating area, casting a soft light over the tables and the few patrons who lingered there, laughing and chatting as they sipped their drinks. John arrived a few minutes early and found a table near the back, away from the main crowd. He didn't want to attract attention, and the shadows that stretched across the patio felt like a comforting shield. The soft hum of conversation around him filled the air, but John's mind was elsewhere, turning over the events of the past few weeks. His life with the shadows of the night was a constant whirlwind of covert missions and hidden dangers. But tonight, he wanted to leave that behind, if only for a few hours. He checked his watch. Kara was running a little late, but that was normal for her. Even at the academy, she had never been one to arrive early, always pushing things to the last minute, but somehow managing to pull it off without ever seeming rushed. John smiled at the thought, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. As if on cue, he saw her approaching, weaving through the tables with her usual confident stride. She was dressed casually too, dark jeans and a simple jacket, but there was something about her that still carried the air of the military officer she had become. Her hair was loose tonight, the dark strands falling past her shoulders, and when she spotted John, her face lit up with a smile that made his chest tighten.
"Sorry I'm late,"
Kara said as she reached the table, sliding into the seat across from him.
"Luck's been a nightmare."
John shrugged, smiling.
"I figured as much. No worries."
Kara leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms for a moment before settling into a more relaxed posture.
"I'm glad you agreed to this. I've been buried in fleet operations and meetings for weeks. I needed a night off, and who better to spend it with than an old friend?"
Joan's smile widened, though the word
"friend"
struck something in him. They'd been close once, and now he wasn't sure what this was. Part of him knew he shouldn't be here, that this was a mistake. But another part, the part that had missed her more than he wanted to admit, was glad he had come.
"Same here,"
John said.
"It's been hectic. Feels good to take a break."
Kara raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a playful smile.
"Still not going to tell me what hectic means in your new line of work?"
John chuckled, leaning back in his chair. He had to be careful, as always, but tonight he didn't want to get bogged down in lies and half-truths.
"Let's just say bodyguard work has its ups and downs."
Kara laughed softly, shaking her head.
"Bodyguard work? I still can't picture it. You, standing around all stoic, protecting politicians from who knows what."
She paused, her eyes twinkling.
"I'm glad you were all right, John. You had me worried there for a while."
John nodded, though a part of him wanted to tell her everything. That the real work he was doing had nothing to do with guarding diplomats. That he had killed, that he had become someone entirely different. But he pushed those thoughts down, burying them deep beneath the surface. Tonight wasn't about that. Tonight, he wanted to be the person Kara remembered.
"So,"
Kara said, leaning forward.
"Enough about work. Tell me what you've been up to. What's life like now, outside the academy?"
John hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. He couldn't tell her the truth about the missions, the darkness that followed him everywhere. But he couldn't avoid the question either. So he settled on something vague, something that wouldn't give too much away.
"It's different,"
John said, choosing his words carefully.
"A lot less structured than the academy. You're on your own a lot more, but it's good. I've learned a lot, seen places I never thought I would."
Kara nodded, sipping from the glass of water the waiter had just brought to the table.
"I get that. The frontier was like that for me. So much open space, so many unknowns. It's different from the rigid schedules we had back then, but there's a kind of freedom in it too."
John smiled, though his mind drifted back to the frontier, to the missions he had undertaken in the farthest reaches of the Empire. There had been no freedom there, only duty, but Kara didn't need to know that. Not tonight.
"I've been hearing rumors,"
Kara said after a moment, her voice lower now, as if she were testing the waters.
"About unrest in the outer sectors, about certain nobles making moves against the Emperor."
John's stomach tightened at her words, and for a split second his mind flashed back to Duke Darius, slumped over his desk, a single shot ending his life. He forced himself to stay calm, his expression neutral.
Yeah, I've heard things too,
John said carefully.
but you know how rumors are. Hard to tell what's true and what's just gossip.
Kara watched him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were trying to read him.
You're right, but I can't help feeling like something bigger is coming. There's been tension between the frontier sectors and the capital for years, but now it feels different. Like something's going to give.
John nodded, though he remained silent. He couldn't tell her how right she was, how much more complicated the situation was than she realized. The shadows knew the full extent of the unrest, the factions gathering strength, the covert deals being made. But all of that was far beyond what Kara could know, and John wasn't about to be the one to tell her. Instead, he steered the conversation away from politics, away from anything that might drag him back into the shadows.
What about you?
John asked.
How's life at HQ? Any big projects you're working on?
Kara's face brightened, and she launched into a story about a recent fleet exercise she had overseen, how one of the junior officers had accidentally miscalculated a maneuver and sent half the fleet into chaos. John listened, genuinely enjoying the sound of her voice, the way she told the story with a mix of humor and exasperation. It was easy to forget, for just a moment, the distance that had grown between them. They ordered drinks and talked for what felt like hours, slipping effortlessly back into the rhythm of their old friendship. Kara shared stories of her time on the frontier, of the strange cultures she had encountered and the battles she had fought to keep the trade routes safe. John listened, laughing when appropriate, asking questions to keep the conversation flowing, though always careful to avoid anything that might reveal too much about his own life. As the night wore on, the crowd around them began to thin, and the warm glow of the lanterns became softer, more intimate. The city, which had been so loud and chaotic just hours earlier, seemed to quiet down, leaving John and Kara in a bubble of familiarity and nostalgia.
You know,
Kara said, her voice softer now, her eyes fixed on John.
I missed this. I missed you.
John felt his heart skip a beat, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. He had missed her too, more than he had realized until now. But there was a distance between them that couldn't be bridged, a gap created by the lies he had told and the life he now led.
I missed you too,
John said, the truth slipping out before he could stop it. Kara smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes.
I guess things are different now, huh?
John nodded slowly.
Yeah, they are.
She looked at him for a long moment, as if she were waiting for him to say something more, something that would explain the distance she could sense, but not name. But John stayed silent, unsure of how to explain the darkness that had become his life. Finally, Kara sighed, leaning back in her chair.
Well, whatever's going on with you, I hope you find your way through it. Just don't disappear on me again, okay?
John forced a smile.
I'll try.
Kara gave him a playful nudge.
You'd better, or I'll come find you myself.
They both laughed, though John could feel the tension beneath the surface. The night had been good, better than he had expected, but it couldn't last. The world he lived in now didn't leave room for connections like this. Still, for a few hours, he'd felt like the person he used to be, and for that he was grateful. As they stood to leave, Kara hesitated, her eyes lingering on him.
Let's do this again sometime,
she said softly.
We don't have to let things get weird, right?
John nodded, though deep down he knew it wouldn't be that simple.
Yeah,
he said, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil.
We'll do it again.
Kara smiled and leaned in, giving him a quick hug before stepping back.
Take care of yourself, John. You too, Kara.
She gave him one last smile before turning and walking away, disappearing into the quiet streets of Nova Lux. John stood there for a moment, watching her go, the warmth of her presence still lingering. But as the shadows of the city closed in around him, he felt the cold weight of his reality settling over him once more. He had spent a few hours pretending to be someone he no longer was, But the truth was, the shadows had already claimed him, and they wouldn't let him go.